Hello, Muse. It's me. You remember me? We go through this every time. How can you not remember who I am? I know. You know. You know who I am. Anyway, doesn't really matter. Whether you know me or not, you're stuck with me just like I'm stuck with you. Anyway, I have something very helpful to talk about today for my fellow writers. Yeah, I know it seems like it's been forever since I've actually talked about some nuts and bolts. And it's not the actual thing I was going to talk about last week, which was interrupted by a mishap or something that happened. It's something different. So I'll eventually get to what I wanted to talk about last week. This time around, I had something else occur that made me want to share with you. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying you know perfectly well that I'm all about transparency. I don't hide anything from people. And whether it be in the business or the craft of writing. And right now I'm going to share with you something that happened to me thanks to another beta reader. Now, this is for Defying Gravity, a book that I'm very happy about and I'm very excited to release. It has been in the hands of beta readers for a few weeks now, and the overwhelming feedback for this is amazing. The readers absolutely love the book. Across the board, no one has had any real complaints about it, except for one little tiny thing that I'm going to talk about right now. Now, you know I have a rule with beta readers. My rule is this, that if one beta reader has a problem with something, it's an opinion. If multiple beta readers, like 3 or more beta readers, have a problem with something, it's an issue and you have to deal with it. Now, in this instance, only one of numerous beta readers had a problem with something. But I trust this beta reader, and something in the back of my head said, you need to think about this. You need to break your own rule and consider what they said. Now, what they said was that they felt the beginning of the book was a little slow. I thought, whoa, okay. That's new, because everybody else just said that the book connected with them immediately. So I thought about this. Now, one of the things I've tried to do with my beta readers this time around, because of the nature of this book, is that I have sought out beta readers from different backgrounds. Now, this book deals very heavily with the theater. So I wanted some beta readers that were involved in the theater, and then I wanted some beta readers that were not involved with the theater. I knew that the beta readers that were involved with the theater in one way or another would immediately connect and get the book. And I needed beta readers that were not part of the theater to see if they got it. So far they have. But I was surprised that the beta reader that said the book started out slowly was someone who has been involved in theater. So, which is one of the reasons why I had to stop and go, maybe let's just revisit this. So I went back and I reread the beginning of the book a few times, from the beginning of chapter 1 to the end of chapter 1. And I couldn't quite figure it out because I was immediately sucked into it. Of course, I wrote it, I should be. And then it dawned on me what I had done in the introduction, in the very beginning of this book. Now, I want to use, like I did last week, I want to go back to a running analogy because it's foremost in my mind right now. In fact, as soon as we get done here, I'm going to go for a run. Anyway, there are 3 different types of footfalls. That is when your foot hits the pavement. There is the heel strike, the midfoot strike, and the forefoot strike. I'm pretty sure you can figure out which is which. The heel strike is when you strike the ground first on your heel. The midfoot strike is when you strike the ground in the middle of your foot. The forefoot strike is when you hit the ground with the front of your foot, the ball of your foot. Now, if you run outside and play around with this, you'll understand what I'm talking about. When you hit your heel first, it's almost like you're leaning back a little bit. Okay? When you hit your midfoot strike, it's almost like you're standing straight up. It's not until you get into the forefoot strike that you feel like you're leaning forward. Now, what's very interesting about this is if you take off slowly, and it doesn't really matter what kind of foot striker you are, but if you take off slowly and you start picking up speed to the point where you're sprinting by the time you get to your sprint, you're going to be forefoot striking, because the forefoot strike pushes you forward. It makes you go faster. There are other issues with the forefoot strike, but I'm a midfoot striker, just for those that want to know. But it really does. You really get this sensation of falling forward. Okay? So when I went back and read the opening of the book, I started thinking about that. I started wondering, what kind of heel strike is happening at the beginning of this book? I know it sounds a little weird, but I apply all sorts of weird things to my craft, so you get used to it after a while. And I kept reading it. I kept reading the first few paragraphs over and over and over again, and I realized that the first few paragraphs were heel striking. They were going forward, but they were going forward kind of at a backwards angle. And I thought, how can I move that forward a little bit? How can I immediately pick up, how can I immediately have momentum in the beginning of this book without feeling like I'm pushing and without feeling like I have to throw in just a bunch of action and all sorts of craziness at the beginning just to get the momentum going? Because I didn't want to do that. I wanted to sort of ease in to the character in the story, but I wanted to ease in leaning forward. And it immediately dawned on me after I started applying that line of thought what was going on. What I needed was a little bit of universality to the opening of the book. I wanted something that could grab the attention and could be relatable to by anyone. Because the way I had written it, if you were a person in the theater, if you had experience with the theater, you would immediately go, oh, this is going to be something exciting. I can relate to this. I know this person. I know what this person's going through. And you're immediately hooked. But if you're not so deeply entrenched in that world, it's going to take you a while to get up to speed, to feel like you're in the character's shoes. So instead of relying so heavily on the world of the theater, I thought, let's open it up a bit. Let's lean it forward. Let's give it something that everyone can relate to, regardless of your background, regardless of who you are. So it only took me about 3 paragraphs, one being a normal size paragraph, 2 of them being very short paragraphs, to get that in place. So now when you read the book, you're immediately forefoot striking, you're moving forward instantly, and you're immediately connecting to the story, because it has that the opening paragraph has something for everybody that everyone can relate to. Now, I should also say, I should have prefaced this at the very beginning, and I've said this before, that I am very much of the school that when you have to fix a book, when you have to fix problems in your story, you should do as minimal work as you can to get the biggest payoff. Why? It's very simple. Let's say, for example, I heeded that advice from that beta reader who said the book's kind of slow in the beginning. And I said, oh, good God, I guess I'm going to have to rewrite the whole chapter. So I go back and I rewrite the whole chapter, which I would never do. But let's say I did that. All of a sudden, I have a disjointed chapter because of the way I write, because of everything I write is cause and effect. I'm going to introduce things into this new chapter that I'm probably going to have to deal with and rewrite later on. Even if it's tiny, it's very much chaos theory. It's very much the butterfly effect. Even if it's a tiny little thing in the beginning that I have changed, that tiny little thing could then have an effect later on. And who knows where else. So I'm going to have to be very careful and go back and check everything. So instead of making larger changes, I make the smallest possible change that I can to achieve the goal at hand. So when someone said it felt slow in the beginning, I realized the problem. I've thought about how I could fix the problem with the least amount of effort, and that doesn't mean I'm lazy. The least amount of with introducing the least amount of new ideas and issues in the book. So I realized all I had to do was add a paragraph or two at the beginning, and that was it. And I hold very true to that idea that as little change once the manuscript is complete, even when I get feedback, the littlest amount of change is what I always focus on. Simply because you just never know what a large change is going to do to the cause and effect of a book. Now, granted, when I finish a first draft of a manuscript, the story is usually 98% coherent and true. So I don't usually have to make those kinds of big changes. There's only been one book in my life, in my career, that I've had to make two books that I've had to make major changes to. The first one was Gothica, because I started using a new editor, and this was way back. And she said, you need to rearrange some of these chapters. Me being kind of new at it at the time, I said, okay, let's rearrange some chapters. And that caused a lot of work. Of course, everybody knows about I Zombie I, where I originally wrote it as first person present tense, and then was told immediately by my editor, you need to write this in first person past tense. It just has to happen. That was a serious change that caused a lot of extra work and a lot of headache for me. And I think that part of the way I work now is because of what happened with I Zombie I. And I'm very careful when I write a story that I listen to my gut and I don't force things, so that in the end the story is coherent and complete, so I don't have to go back and make major changes. But when I do have to make a change, whether it be small or big, I always make sure that I introduce as little change as possible to get the effect necessary. And always remembering that and I know this is kind of, like I said at the beginning, it's a strange analogy, but at the beginning of a book, I always like to be forefoot striking. And then usually after about the inciting incident of a book, then I go back and I'll do some midfoot striking. And then towards the end, I'll do some heel striking. It's just a way of making the reader, not pushing them, but getting them the sense of moving forward and then easing up a little bit so they can be comfortable, and then slowing it down a little bit. And then sometimes in the end, I'll go back to the forefoot strikes and lead them in to the conclusion. I know it's kind of a random analogy, but it works for me. It may work for you, it may not. I don't know. And hopefully you've learned something from this, because I certainly have. I mean, just the idea of the foot strikes really gives you this visceral image of the creation of a story. Anyway, that's all I had to share with you this time, Muse. Hope you learned something from it. I'm sure you did. You're always learning, just like you're telling me to always learn. Because, Muse, you are awesome.